This is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Chapter 1, Part 2. Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find that his will was beginning to weaken. He didn't realise that this was because of an old drinking game that Ford learnt to play in the hyperspace ports that served the Madrianite mining belts in the star system of Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth game called Indian Wrestling and was played like this. 2 contestants would sit either side of a table with a glass in front of each of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of Jank's spirit, as immortalised in that ancient Orion mining song. "Oh, don't give me no more of that old Jank spirit. No, don't you give me no more of that old Jank spirit. For my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that old sinful Jank spirit?" Each of the 2 contestants would then concentrate their will on the bottle and attempt to tip it and pour spirit into the glass of his opponent, who would then have to drink it. The bottle would then be refilled. The game would be played again and again. Once you started to lose, you would probably keep losing, because one of the effects of Jank's spirit is to depress telepsychic power. As soon as a predetermined quantity had been consumed, the final loser would have to perform a forfeit, which was usually obscenely biological. Ford Prefect played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the Horse and Groom after all. "What about my house?" he asked plaintively. Ford looked across to Mr. Prosser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. "He wants to knock your house down." "Yes, he wants to build—" "And he can't, because you're lying in front of the bulldozers." "Yes, and—" "I'm sure we can come to some arrangement," said Ford. Excuse me," he shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with a spokesman for the bulldozer drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard, and how much they should get paid if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to find that Arthur had company. "Hello, yes," he called. "Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet?" "Can we, for a moment," called Ford, "assume that he hasn't?" "Well," sighed Mr. Prosser. "And can we also assume," said Ford, "that he's going to be staying here all day?" So all your men are going to be standing around here all day, doing nothing. Could be. Well, if you're resigned to doing that anyway, you don't actually need him to lie here all the time, do you? What? You don't, said Ford patiently, actually need him here. Well, no, not as such, he said. Not exactly need. Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. Ford said, "So if you would just like to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could slip off down the pub for half an hour. How does that sound?" Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly potty. "That sounds perfectly reasonable," he said in a reassuring tone, wondering who he was trying to reassure. "And if you want to pop off for a quick one yourself later on," said Ford, "we can always cover for you in return." "Thank you very much," said Mr. Prosser, who no longer knew how to play this at all. "Thank you very much. Yes, that's very kind." He frowned, then smiled, then tried to do both at once and failed, grasped hold of his fur hat and rolled it fitfully round the top of his head. He could only assume that he had just won. "So," continued Ford Prefect, "if you would just like to come over here and lie down." "What?" said Mr. Prosser. "Ah, I'm sorry," said Ford. Perhaps I didn't make myself fully clear. Somebody has to lie in front of the bulldozers, haven't they? Or there won't be anything to stop them driving into Mr. Dent's house. What? Said Mr. Prosser again. It's very simple, said Ford. My client, Mr. Dent, says that he will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come and take over from him. What are you talking about? Said Arthur, but Ford nudged him with the sole of his foot to keep quiet. You want me, said Mr. Prosser, spelling out this new thought to himself, to come and lie there? Yes. In front of the bulldozer? Yes. Instead of Mr. Dent? Yes. In the mud. In, as you say it, the mud. As soon as Mr. Prosser realised that he was substantially the loser after all, it was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. This was more like the world he knew. He sighed. In return for which, you will take Mr. Dent with you down the pub. That's it, said Ford. That's it exactly. Mr. Prosser took a few nervous steps forward and stopped. Promise? Promise, said Ford. He turned to Arthur. Come on, he said to him. Get up, let the man lie down. Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Prosser, who sadly, awkwardly sat down in the mud. He felt that his whole life was some kind of dream, and he sometimes wondered whose it was and whether they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself round his bottom and his arms and oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely. And no sneaky knocking down Mr. Dent's house while he's away. All right, he said. The mere thought, growled Mr. Prosser. Hadn't even begun to speculate, he continued, settling himself back, about the merest possibility of crossing my mind. He saw the bulldozer drivers' union representative approaching and let his head sink back and closed his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving that he did not now constitute a mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain of this. His mind seemed to be full of noise, horses, smoke, and stench of blood. This always happened when he felt miserable and put upon, and he had never been able to explain it to himself. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, that the mighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind the eyelids. Bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in the mud, indecipherable strangers handing out inexplicable humiliations, and an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day! What a day! Ford Prefect knew that it didn't matter a pair of dingoes' kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not. Arthur remained very worried. Can we trust him? He said. Myself, I trust him to the ends of the earth, said Ford. Oh yes, said Arthur. How far's that? About 12 minutes away, said Ford. Come on, I need a drink. That's the end of chapter 1. Do do do.